We are here today to talk about cities and sustainable cities, and it's a topic for us at Worldwatch that is both very exciting and very challenging. And what you're going to hear today are a number of speakers who will be talking about the problems that sustainable cities pose, and also some of the potential solutions for creating actually the problems that existing cities pose, and then the solutions that sustainable cities might be able to give us. But my job today is to begin by talking about a vision for sustainable cities. So we're going to kind of start at a very high level and talk just about 7 principles of sustainability. It turns out that we don't have a particular defined way to think about sustainable cities, and for that reason I chose a drawing as our opening slide, because it's all still very much in progress. So, what is a sustainable city? As I just said, we don't have a strong definition for that, but we do have 7 principles. And what I would like to do is just run over those quickly. Sustainable cities, thank you, are compact and connected. They are clean and efficient. Sustainable cities are rooted in nature. They are happy and interactive. They are a center of well-being. They're centers of well-being. They're people-focused, and they're broadly governed. So we're going to do a guided tour of a sustainable city today, and we're going to stop at all 7 of those places. Perhaps a simple way to think about a sustainable city is that it is a vibrant human settlement that provides ample opportunities in harmony with the natural environment to create dignified lives for all. So that's what I hope we'll be able to see in the details that we'll be discussing today. So the first principle, our first stop on this tour, is that cities are compact and connected. It's all about connection. Cities are networks, and if you think about it, they are transportation networks, they are social networks, they're digital networks, they're biodiversity networks. So they are places where a lot of different systems come together. And to the degree that we can preserve those connections, enhance those connections, we're moving more in the sustainability direction. Now, connection, of course, is a function of density. This slide just shows a couple of different cities and their density. You can see that it's quite a range. In Atlanta, just 636 people per square kilometer. Where you go all the way down to the bottom, in the most dense cities in East Asia, you can have 30,000 or more people per square kilometer. And of course, although density tends to promote connection, that doesn't mean the more dense the better, necessarily. I mean, there's a limit that we hit, and many experts talk about 5,000 to 15,000 people as being per square kilometer as being about a good density for cities. So the question here is, which of these patterns, because density is governed by different patterns of development, which of these is the most connected? Which will lead to the greatest connections in the city? The grid one, exactly, thank you. The one on the left does that. The one on the right, you saw Atlanta in the previous slide as being not very dense at all. It tends to have loops and lollipops, as it's called, on the right 2 photos there. That tends to be their pattern of development. But the greatest density and the greatest number of connections tends to happen in a grid pattern. And in a grid pattern, you tend to see slower traffic but steadier traffic. You tend to see more small retail and not big box stores. You tend to see more walking and cycling. And in that way, the cities of the future are more likely to contain more of a grid system than some of these other patterns. It's very important insight that urban planners have given us. It turns out that actually 55% of the streets in the roadways in Atlanta are of the type on the very right there. And one study in 2014 kind of summed this up nicely. They said the more intersections, the better the health of people in cities, because there's lower levels of obesity, lower levels of diabetes, and heart disease. So more intersections, I think, is a nice rule of thumb if it turns out that that study holds across many cities. More intersections means better health. So what does that look like in reality? This is a woonerf in the Netherlands. This is a typical kind of street that's in a very densely developed area. And what you see here is that the street clearly is not primarily for automobile traffic. It's set up so that people, pedestrians can use it, kids can use it to play in. It does handle automobile traffic as well, of course, but those cars that pass through here tend to go very slowly. There tends not to be a big division between what we would call the sidewalk and the street, although you do see a bit of a curve here, but often in some of these shared space kinds of arrangements, it's one flat surface and very, very close, with buildings very close together. So that is the kind of residential pattern that we might expect to see in sustainable cities. Now downtown we see kind of a different dynamic. Here we see more segregated modes of transport. So you can see, this is Vancouver. You can see bicycles have their own segregated space on the right there. Cars do as well. In some cities you would see a bus lane as well, and of course pedestrians have the sidewalk. The idea there is that by safely segregating these different modes of transportation, you get a better and more attractive and more livable set of streets downtown. This is a graphic, a set of photos that I think is rather old at this point, and it's just basically meant to give a sense of the space required by pedestrians, people who ride a bus, bicyclists, and cars. And the bottom line there being that automobiles use a lot of space, and if you're designing your city around using automobiles, if that's the center of your transportation, you're going to need a lot more space than if you do otherwise. Of course, in transportation, the preferred way is multimodal. So we like to see in a sustainable city areas where rail and metro and bus, and I would add bicycles and pedestrians, can all interact, where they all come together. Because when that happens, you take the stress off of any one of those modes, and you make very possible where those different modes come together, development and dense development. It becomes very feasible and very attractive for people. Now, of course, it's one thing to say we're going to have buses, we're going to have bicycles, but you really have to design around it. And this graphic is meant to show what happens when you're planning around bicycles. You can see the blue line on the right is a bicycle path, and you can also see that there are bump outs in the intersection that keep the cars from turning directly into the bicycles without the bicycles being seen. So bicycles can make a right turn here, they can go straight, but in every case they are seen clearly by the cars, and it's meant to be safer that way. So a second principle on our guided tour is that sustainable cities will be clean and efficient, and they will use a minimum of materials. You may be aware that some scientists in Germany who specialize in materials use have determined that we really need to reduce, in industrial countries, reduce materials use by a factor of 4 or 5 if we're going to be able to open up the environmental space for people in developing countries to build their infrastructure. That's a 75 to 80% reduction in materials use. So that's going to take all the ingenuity that we have to figure out how to do that and to do it in a clean way. We can talk about energy there are, I think, a handful of cities in the United States that claim to be 100% renewable energy, renewable electricity, excuse me, that's an important distinction. Renewable electricity. Costa Rica last year, this is an older slide, but last year said that it had achieved 99% renewable electricity for the entire year of 2015. It's a huge accomplishment for the country as a whole to do that. And of course, most of that is happening in cities because 3/4 of the population in Costa Rica lives in cities. And of course, wind energy, in some parts of the world, it's not the most attractive energy source, even if it is clean, but it is evolving and can be really wonderful even in urban settings. And of course, we can talk about solar electricity and solar hot water. These will be very, very common, as you'll hear later in today, in sustainable cities. They'll be, in Israel, I think they already are. Solar hot water is prominent there. I think 90% plus of folks use it. We also need to find efficiencies. We need to be much more efficient with the energy and the materials that we're using. This is a photo from Los Angeles, which undertook a lighting retrofit 2 or 3 years ago. And you can see on the right side of this tunnel is the new LED lighting. They put 140,000 new LED lights into the system. And on the left side, of course, you see the old system, which doesn't light as well. They've saved 63% in terms of energy. Carbon emissions, of course, are down. Crime is down in areas that have these lights put in by 10.5%. And they calculate that the savings will generate payback within 7 years in the city. So it's one of those wonderful stories because it appears to be win-win-win all the way around. And we need to encourage many, many cities to pursue these opportunities. Of course, when we're talking about materials, we inevitably will talk about waste. And what we're trying to do, what a sustainable city will try to do, is to close the nutrient loops. So that means that we're building circular economies in which all materials, or the vast majority of materials, are circulating both technical materials, metals and minerals, as well as compostable materials, food primarily. We want to see cities where all of those materials are coming around. And here you can see blocks of cans and other sorts of metal that have been crushed into cubes. That's the sort of thing we would have tossed into a landfill years ago. It's now viewed as a resource increasingly, and that makes a lot of sense. And of course, when we talk about waste and reducing waste, there are different actors who have different roles. One of the actors, of course, is government. And they can set up recycling programs, they can encourage recycling, they can set up take-back laws so that companies operating within a city need to make a commitment to take back the materials that they have been using. Industry also has a role. I'm not sure how long plastic will be a big part of our lives in sustainable cities, but it is now, and folks are finding some very clever ways to deal with it. So we have a chair here on the left, and what I was really impressed with was this bridge that's made entirely from recycled plastic products, and it's a railroad bridge. So it supports quite a lot of weight. We also have personal responsibility. This is from the Trash is for Tossers blog. The woman on the left is the woman who writes that blog. And what I found really interesting about this, she deliberately puts a picture of herself on her blog so that you will know that she's not some sort of geek. She's actually very cool. But she doesn't use a lot of material. She doesn't generate a lot of waste. In fact, the jar on the right is her waste over a 2-year period. And she says she's done this by buying in bulk, by composting, and by avoiding the purchase of packaging. And she's been able to get her waste down tremendously. And yet a regular person. We don't talk often enough about the situation in developing countries. Again, plastic here is an issue. I'm not sure how long this solution will be available, but this is basically 2-liter bottles stuffed with soil that are being used to build a house. And in this case, the house is very efficient, is about 1/3 the cost of a house the same size. This is in Nigeria, by the way. And of course provides work. It's 18 times stronger also than a traditional mud house would be. The third principle on our stop is that cities need to be rooted in nature. You know, often we think of nature in cities now as something like Central Park or the mall or Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. And really, nature needs to have a much stronger and robust presence in cities. And what you see here are a lot of green roofs that can help to be part of that plan. And the ideal really is to think about a city, if it were a circle, as having spokes radiating from the center, those spokes being biodiversity corridors, so parks that come out from the center. And then those spokes being linked through concentric circles, or not just circles, but a web of other activity that includes things like gardens and parks and green roofs and this kind of thing. So you're really, nature is not confined to a single area. It's diffused throughout the city. When you do that, you get purer air and water, you get reduced heat island effect, and increased biological diversity. And this is just some of the ways that nature could appear more robustly within cities. It could also appear with a greater purpose. Some cities are using what they call green infrastructure, which is largely a way to handle wastewater, that is stormwater, better said. And you can see in the top photograph here an area in a sidewalk where stormwater is being collected, and of course it's processed more naturally. It's not just being channeled into conduits, concrete conduits. On the right side, you see a city that has a wetland that is used to absorb stormwater. Fourth principle, and this is probably my favorite one, is happy and interactive. Cities really have a lot of wonderful places, and in fact we use the word placemaking to talk about creating areas within cities that really are attractive for people, that help people to meet and to have fun together. So you just see different examples of how this is done in various cities, and this can be done on very small scale, very large scale. In fact, I was very surprised to read in doing this research that Los Angeles and New York both have around 30,000 vacant lots in their cities. Now those lots are sometimes tiny, and sometimes they're larger, but that's a lot of area where you could really create centers that people want to go to. And there should be many of them, and they should be walkable from one to another. And when you do that, you give a city character. You make it fun. You make it an interesting place to go. Some more examples. I like the one on the lower right here, where it looks like folks just pulled out their own table and chairs and for Saturday morning coffee out on the sidewalk. I'm imagining that this is their home. You can be very deliberate about this placemaking. This is a METROCABLE system in Medellín, Colombia, and you can see this goes from the hillsides where the poorest people live in Medellín down into the valley and connects with the metro in Medellín. And when they were building this, they knew that they were going to need these pylons, and these pylons could create courtyards, and they created courtyards around them, and they become gathering places and places for small business and new housing, affordable housing to go in. So they had placemaking in mind as they developed the transportation infrastructure. And this is probably my favorite. This is in front of the cathedral in Barcelona. My wife and I were there years ago and stumbled upon 5 o'clock in the afternoon on a Saturday, people doing a traditional folkloric dance there that was just mesmerizing to watch. And they just took, open space in front of the cathedral. It's attractive space. A band is out there, and they do this wonderful dance where they link arms And it's just very mesmerizing and beautiful. It's a wonderful example, I think, of placemaking. Cities should be a center of well-being. And I can attest to the truth of this. We need in cities to find that they are being designed for health and that there are spaces that are built around health. In China, I think since 1998, there have been 4,500 free outdoor gyms that have been built since 1998. So people can stop and do some exercise. You may have seen in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, along the beach, that there's running paths and biking paths, in addition to gyms like this on the beach as well. So they're really making a concerted effort to make health a part of the urban experience. And of course, you can set up health promotion, exercise classes and that kind of thing outdoors. We also, when we talk about a center of well-being, of course, people need work. They need income. There are many ways that this can be created, but the ILO, the International Labor Organization, talks about a decent work agenda, which is probably a good guideline for many cities to keep in mind, where you're creating jobs, guaranteeing rights at work, extending social protection, and promoting social dialogue. In addition to that, you can talk about specific government programs that create work, even for and especially for the poor. So in Brazil, for example, the Bolsa Verde program is one where people get not quarterly, a trimesterly stipend in return for doing conservation work around their town. So it's a way to promote development because it's an increase in their income in addition to promoting conservation. Principle 6, cities need to be people-focused. I love this quote. First life, then spaces, then buildings. The other way around never works. And I think too often we pursue development in cities the other way around. So what should be a city's development policy? How should you figure out what the priorities should be? I think one interesting idea that's out there is the idea that we should perhaps design development around Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because that's what people need. Why shouldn't development follow the pattern of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? So you can reduce that hierarchy to just 3 here and talk about basic needs. And in terms of water, if you were designing water policy in the city, of course you want to have drinking water and sanitation and all of those basic provisions. You can also talk about relational needs. People need to be able to relate to each other. And what often happens, these examples are from Australia, what often happens is during Australian droughts, the thing that gets its water cut first are parks and sports fields and areas where people gather and socialize and interact. And yet, there's a huge share of water in Australia that is not processed and could be used for projects like this to make sure that soccer fields, in this case football fields, are not allowed to die and to go dry. In that way, you're promoting relational needs. You can also talk about transcendent needs, which would be things like equality and dignity. And in Australia, one of the ideas that was proposed is that people be allowed to capture their own rainwater. And so the picture there is a container for doing that. And that allows them to save money. For the poor, it can make a big difference in their income. And so I think it's a very interesting idea to think about development policy as following a hierarchy of needs. And finally, our last stop is that sustainable cities should be broadly governed. And what that means is that power should be distributed and devolved. Decision-making processes should be public and transparent. Citizens should be encouraged to participate. And meeting calendars of city officials should be made public. We see an example of that with participatory budgeting, which you may know from Porto Alegre in Brazil, where citizens get together and they get a certain part of the budget that they get to weigh in on and have some influence over. That process is now in place to one degree or another in 1,500 cities around the world. So participatory budgeting is becoming a more popular thing, including New York City to a limited degree. Citizens there have the capacity to weigh in on budgets. So just to sum up, if I were to boil these principles down into three broader categories, I would say that sustainable cities will set important limits. So for example, we're not going to continue to use fossil fuels in an open-ended kind of way. They will promote a healthful society, and they will create widespread opportunity for all. It's a huge challenge, as I think you will hear in the coming presentations. But it's also one that's very exciting and leaves me feeling somewhat hopeful for the future. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand it over now to Tom Prue, my colleague at Worldwatch, who's also one of the co-directors, who will get serious and start talking about some real challenges that we face in building a sustainable city. So thank you very much.